Owens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen of the House, House Bill 1476 seeks to eliminate the triggers associated with the oil extraction tax and create a stable flat tax for oil extraction should the big trigger take effect. Section 1 adjusts a reference to the section in code for stripper wells. Section 2 deletes some definitions for Century Code related to the rate change associated with the triggers within the bill. Section 3 lowers the oil extraction tax rate to 4.5% of the gross value of the well and deletes all references formerly applied to the old rate, as well as removes the requirement to reset upon a specific price to the old rate based on a set price, commonly called the big trigger. Section 4 deletes all exemptions from the oil extraction tax that references the trigger price for vertical wells, reentry wells, and 2-year inactive wells. Deletes all exemptions on wells drilled on non-trust lands and trust lands within the boundaries of a reservation and lands held by Indian tribes. It also includes the deletion of the price-sensitive exemption commonly known as the small trigger. Section 5, all existing rates reductions currently in place upon the effective date of this act would also expire and be deleted within the code. Section 6 establishes this act's effective date as June 1 once the exemption under subsection 3 of 5751.103, commonly known as the big trigger, becomes active, or when after June the exemption becomes active. Section 7 establishes it as an emergency clause, so it can be active June 1 should that occur. Mr. Speaker and ladies and gentlemen of the House, your Finance and Tax Committee recommends a due pass with a vote of 10-4 and requests your concurrence. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Is there any discussion? Representative Strinden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To me, this isn't a political issue. I don't think there are any good guys or bad guys on either side of this. I think we all want the best for North Dakota, and I personally don't care when it was introduced or how. What this bill comes down to for me is how long you personally think the price of oil will be down. And obviously, I will tell you what I think now. According to Moody's, the big trigger will go into effect in June, as most of us know, and it'll likely stay there for 11 months. If this happens, passing HB 1476 would probably raise revenues this biennium by $120 million. It's really tempting for me to vote yes on this bill because I do truly believe that it will save us money in the short term, and we'll all be happy when we come back next biennium. My worry, though, is about what happens after the price of oil comes up again. Moody's estimates this will happen in May of 2016. In the last 10 years, 2015 is the second time a major dip has happened in oil prices, and in 2009, it rebounded quickly. The small trigger was on for 15 years, about 20 years ago, but if that were to happen now with the huge oil industry as compared to then, we as a legislature would surely do something about it. We're jumping into this decision quickly without really knowing the future, but we do have a little window into the past. If we had put this 9.5% extraction tax into effect when it was introduced in 2011 by our now House Democratic leader, we would have lost almost $1.5 billion between then and now. Obviously, hindsight is 20/20, and that bill was introduced in a different climate to deal with tax fairness, but we now know that would have been a bad policy, and it's still not a good policy. I assume since it didn't pass in 2011, a majority of you agreed that it was a bad policy. HB 1476 will take money away from North Dakota when oil prices are high and the industry doesn't need incentives, and it will displace the trigger incentive that will keep people in their jobs when the price of oil is down. This oil is literally a part of North Dakota. It's a one-time harvest, and the people of North Dakota voted for a 6.5% extraction tax for their harvest. We could monkey around with the triggers, but let's keep the extraction tax the way it is. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Haig.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members of the Assembly. Well, to say the least, it has been a busy and hectic day. I rise to urge a no vote on House Bill 1476. I wanted to be clear, as it was insinuated by a testifier who spoke regarding the bill, that a no vote is not a vote against the industry. I have an incredibly vested interest in the oil industry. My brother-in-law is the manager of a company in Dickinson, and my sister is the office manager there. Their livelihood and that of my 8-month-old niece and 5-year-old nephew all rely heavily on the oil industry. North Dakotans welcome the oil industry and development here in the state. It creates many jobs and opportunities for all communities across North Dakota. However, I believe that it is the responsibility of this chamber to make responsible and rational decisions regarding development, and specifically, in this case, the conversation around the oil extraction tax. This is a 30% reduction in the oil extraction tax, a tax that was put into place by the people of North Dakota. Due to lack of time, we have not been able to get a truly accurate look at a fiscal note. Also, it would have been great to have a fiscal note that looks over this biennium and the next biennium if we remove the trigger and/or flatten the tax. We should key in on reforming the trigger by providing meaningful incentives to the industry to continue investing in North Dakota during downtimes in the market, while easing the impact of the incentive on any given 2-year state budget. This will perhaps be the most important decision we make regarding the future of North Dakota, and we should have had more time. Proponents of the bill are saying that this is not indeed a permanent tax reduction for oil companies, as they say nothing is truly permanent, and the legislature will have a chance to come back and reevaluate the tax structure next session or any session thereafter. That is true, we can do that. However, we have prided ourselves on not increasing taxes in this chamber. I have voted time and again to lower taxes and voted against increasing taxes. So I feel that it would be a pretty difficult bill to pass through this chamber, but I could be wrong. Finally, we had a long discussion this morning, and one of the people who testified in support of this bill talked about stability and how it can provide predictability for the industry. When asked the question, based on your conversation with oil companies, what drives companies to drill? Is it based on price of oil or taxes? And undoubtedly, he said in his experience, it was based on the price of oil. So, Mr. Speaker and members of the Assembly, I would urge a no vote on House Bill 1473 and ask that we not reduce the people's tax by 30%.
Representative P. Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the prime sponsor of the bill yield to a question?
Representative Carlson will yield to the question.
Be happy to, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Carlson, is this a big deal for North Dakota?
Representative Carlson.
Well, that's one of the more broad questions I've ever been asked, but yes, it is a big deal for North Dakota.
May I continue, Mr. Speaker?
You may.
Since it is such a big deal for North Dakota, would you consider adjourning for a couple months so we can talk to our constituents and reconvene later this summer? Or have you received considerable input from the residents of District 41 that they support permanently cutting the oil extraction tax?
Well, Mr.
Representative
Speaker,
Carlson.
I'm not sure what the other representative from District 41 is looking for, but I can tell you that this is not a new friend, this is an old friend. And long before some people were even in this chamber, we had this debate. And it was even a bill introduced to lower that rate by the minority leader sitting across the aisle from me. So, is it do we need more time? We don't need more time. This is a trigger, by the way. I love it when the debate centers around the fact that tomorrow the rate's going to change. If the prices go up, the rate stays the same.
Thank you.
Representative Onstead.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the kindly words from our majority leader. Let's go back to 2011. You know what the effective rate was in 2011? The actual dollars that we collect, 9.5%. Do you know what the effective rate is now? 11.2%. What also happened in 2011? New companies were coming in and they're paying the full rate of 11.5%. Old companies that were here, they're paying an average around 7.5%. Is that fair? No. That bill in 2011 tried to level the playing field. The effective rate was 9.5, it brought the numbers down to 9.5. That's where the level that playing field was at that point. Times are different. Now we're asking for to go from 11.2 to 9.5%. That is a rate reduction. And we want to look at the long-term effects. How do we vote on something that we don't have a fiscal note what the long-term effects are? Take what you want. Use 1.1 million barrels a day at $50. Use 1.2 million barrels a day at $60. Reduction of that. It's over $1 billion a biennium. So we're going to save in the short term $120 million, but in the long term, we're going to lose over $1 billion in the biennium. You know, who's going to sit and do your own business and say, you know, I'm going to protect the price of corn this season, but I'm going to expect a 30% cut from here on out? That's not smart business. And let's look at that trigger. Why did we do the trigger in the first place? Incentivize drilling. Prices were down, we went and tried to incentivize that drilling. So, okay, if the price gets to a certain level, we're going to take away that extraction tax to encourage that. So what are we doing today? Oh, we're going to take that away from you. Well, we're going to lower the tax rate down 2% in time along with that. Oh, that's common sense. We do incentives to encourage that, but most of those incentives have a sunset to it. What does this do? This is permanent. 9.5% level, that's permanent. So what does that extraction tax affect? Let's look at what it affects. The bucket list, and part of that bucket list is education, the Water Resource Trust Fund, and go back over this, take about 5 bienniums at $1 billion. That loss, the Water Resource Trust Fund would fund that pipeline that everybody wants to go to Fargo. It would take care of Fargo's probably their diversion plan. It would help mine it. And it'd help NAS, WAS, Southwest Water Pipeline, real water projects that we've been able to afford at this point over that. It also lowers the legacy fund, something the people voted for to get that legacy fund in place. And so we're going to lower that down. That's the future of North Dakota, based on what? A one-time resource. We're taking that out of the ground. When it's gone, it's gone. The legacy fund was a good move, and now we're going to lower that expectations of the legacy fund, whatever we want, be at that point. So let's go back to 2011 where the question was. We tried to level the playing field then. We're not leveling the playing field today. That was a zero revenue loss in 2011 because that's what the effective tax rate is. If we take this down to 9.5 from 11.2, which is the effective tax rate, that's a loss of revenue. And we're going to ask to remove that trigger and get that. But in the long term, the state of North Dakota is going to lose. And remember, it's a one-time resource, and the state of North Dakota is going to lose. That trigger was put in place as an incentive for oil companies. Why aren't they drilling? Price is low. Extraction tax is high. They're expecting that 6.5% reduction so they can complete those 900 wells that are out there. Renegotiate some costs. They complete those wells, production comes up. But it's what it was intended to do, incentivize that drilling. Now, we're going to make a choice. A savings of $120 million versus over $1 billion loss from here on out. It's a 30% reduction, but just think about it, it's $1 billion. Put that over 5-6 bienniums. That's $10,000 per person for every man, woman, and child in North Dakota. Now, that's quite a legacy fund. But we're not going to look at that. I got to look at the infrastructure that's going to go out. The SIF fund. What funded the SIF fund? The extraction tax. What did we use that SIF fund this year? It was a stimulus package for Western North Dakota and for DOT. We start reducing the amount of money in the SIF fund, then the likelihood of one-time projects that we've been building on, whether it's higher ed, whether it's property tax relief, it puts all of that in question. So, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen Assembly, this is 2015, it's not 2011, and we're going to face a dilemma here, and I think this is the wrong way to go, because it's a whole different era at this point. I hope we can vote red on this, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Representative Schneider.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, we can't always find stability and predictability in an unstable and unpredictable world. And our commodity prices, our oil and our ag prices will continue to go up and down. Jim Stensley, who testified as a private citizen this morning, said, "We all live on the prairie where life has always had its ups and downs." He questioned whether we should smooth those for one group. Mr. Stensley said that the needs of the people are every bit as important as an industry. This session we had and rejected the opportunity to smooth some things out for disabled veterans, for seniors in need of services, for workers needing affordable housing, for school children needing lunch, for the young men and women graduating from our universities with the highest percentage of debt in the nation, and for communities and universities that need capital improvements. We rejected those because we couldn't afford to implement needed changes. Now we have the most expensive potential change of the session, and it has been rushed through like no other bill this session, starting last Friday and making it to the floor for a vote today. What are the consequences to our water and flood projects, to education, to the legacy fund and SIF funds? Do we really know? Many questions remain and were asked at the hearings today and remained unanswered. We did not have expert information to be able to make determinations about what this would cost in the future. We think that after the first biennium, this plan could cost the state over $1 billion a biennium. Voters may think that rushing rashly ahead on this 30% extraction tax reduction may be illogical, irresponsible, or irrational if we don't consider the consequences properly. We don't want this bill to turn out to be the great North Dakota giveaway of our one-time natural resources, especially when 80% or more of that money goes out of state. Let's take some time, get some public input, and consider more possible alternatives. We don't want short-term gain to result in our long-term pain. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Kepenik.
Mr. Speaker, members of the Assembly, anybody, well, the new members probably haven't seen some of this, but actually we've talked about these taxes on oil. I know at least 3 bienniums I've been co-sponsor on, except last session I didn't. But one of the things is people got to understand, we've been kind of running this the same way the oil companies have. If we actually think this is going to last for the time periods that have been stated, at meetings I've been to, they're talking 30, 40 years. We got to quit the attitude of grab as much as you can, as fast as you can, because that's basically what we've been doing. You look at when we get into this, and I'm not going to argue that have we peaked out. I don't think we have probably yet. Have we have issues out there? Yeah, we have. But you know, the thing is every bill I've been on, we've been looking at about $800 million to $1 billion every fiscal note. And when you look at what we're faced with today on the uncertainty of dropping off the 6.5, I think it's probably something that we should look at. That do we want to keep trying to budget in this form or fashion where you're guessing what's going to happen? I think a bill like this, like I said, I think we should have addressed this probably 6 years ago. That's true. I think people are bringing up stuff that has happened. Sure, was there more money? It's always been that way. I mean, the energy industry has been up and down. This thing is cyclical, and it's going to happen again. We're going to go through this again. I've read a book. It's called The Prize, and this has been going on for 150 years. That this oil, we overproduce, and then the prices drop, and then you have a stagnant. I just think that trying to get some type of basic foundation into our tax policy is good business. It isn't something to try to grab as much as you can as fast as you can. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Hedlund.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members of the Assembly. A lot's been said about effective tax rates. I happen to have the information available that since 2011, if the bill would have gone into effect, exactly what the effective tax was, and it was a little higher than 9.5%. And we don't need to get into things like that, but if we want to bring up history, let's talk about where we came from. We had a viable industry. The people decided to put a tax on oil, the extraction tax, and they did it. They voted for it. And what happened? The rigs pulled up and they left. So in 1987, I believe the year the trigger actually was debated and passed as law, it was put on to try to attract some of those rigs back to the state, essentially for vertical drilling. 1987 till now, things have changed a lot. And I don't think that the triggers work in today's environment with horizontal drilling. Everybody's talked about the possible loss of future revenues. Well, Mr. Speaker, that's part of what we're trying to fix here. Nobody has talked about what happens if we do nothing and we allow the trigger to go into place. Can anybody here tell me how long that trigger is going to stay in place? I think it was mentioned on the floor already. The last time the trigger was in effect, it stayed on for 17 years. Now, I'm not suggesting that that'll happen this time. But can anybody here tell me how long it will stay on? Because if it stays on, what we do know, Mr. Speaker, is if the trigger stays on through the next biennium, when we come back, there's no money in the SIF fund. There's no money for water projects. There's no money for property tax relief. The education funding formula probably will have to be massively changed because of the amount of oil tax revenue that has been put into that. Is that responsible government when we know this problem faces us? I don't think so. The question of why at the last minute, Mr. Speaker, I would contend to you that we have been looking at this since the day we got here, and we started to see a developing trend in oil production, or oil prices. And that trend was on a steady downward path from about shortly before we got here until a week ago, when all of a sudden, due to probably normal this time of year increases in trends, it started to inch back up. I don't think it's responsible of us to turn a blind eye to this and stick our head in the sand. We're elected here to take care of government, to take care of funding of budgets, and we need to do what we can do to make sure that when we come back, we've got an environment where we don't have to look at making massive reductions. And I'm talking real cuts to budgets and departments. So, Mr. Speaker, this is a hard thing to pass. There's no doubt about it. Industry doesn't like it. Tribes don't like it. I don't stand here and tell you that a lot of legislators like having to do this. But for the predictability of revenues, for stability of government, I think it's something that we have to do today. So I would hope you would support your committee on this and vote green. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Gulisberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the bill carrier answer a question?
Representative Owens, will you yield to question?
I'll be happy to, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Gulisberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Owens, I was wondering, did your committee get any long-term projections, or did they ask for long-term projections, or do you know where you could get some long-term projections that would affect this bill or would be affected by this bill?
Representative Owens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House, Representative Gulisberg, the only long-term projections we got, well, I take that back. We actually got a look forward. Hang on, let me find it. What we did do was we got a look at when the price of oil was at its highest level, what would have happened had 1420 back in 2011 taken effect. And while it's almost 2 full bienniums, it didn't quite make $1.5 billion in a reduction. But to answer your question, I think I have a piece of paper here that talks about comparison of a full biennium of the oil extraction tax revenue if the big trigger's not in effect for 24 months versus the flat rate. And the estimate, and this was based, again, you've got to remember that the industry within itself is fraught with numerous variables that include price, number of rigs, location, type of drilling, tax, and workforce availability. But just taking some of those variables and placing them at the same place for an entire year, which we know will never happen, price, less than 15% discount, and the posted price of North Dakota Sweet, number of barrels, that sort of thing, it comes to, at 4.5, 1.7 billion, and received versus 2.4 billion. So that's 700 million. That's roughly 700 million difference, and that's over a full biennium between the two. So it's not billions as we've heard.
Mr. Speaker, may I continue?
You may.
More question. Just so I have this straight, you're talking about the previous bienniums. If the proposed tax rate was put on in the 2 previous bienniums, is that what you're saying?
Representative Owens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, Representative Gulisberg. No, I was talking about from here out. If we started from here out and we went 2 bienniums, we went a full biennium rather, 2 full years, the 4.2 versus the 6.5, because the difference between the 4.2 and the big trigger is 1.4 billion. That's why the big trigger needs to go away.
Would you answer another question, Representative?
Representative Owens, will you yield to question?
Mr. Speaker, I'll be happy to.
Representative Owens, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Owens, did you also look at how the prices have changed since you got your fiscal note, and if that would have affected the fiscal note? Now it's 120 million in the positive, but prices have changed since that fiscal note was created.
Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, Representative Gulisberg, that fiscal note was created, I believe, last Friday. So yes, I think it's changed 1 day's worth. So no, it's not being updated daily if that's what you're asking me. And the examples that were used were set in the range that it is now at 55 minus the estimated discount, which puts it down to 46, and at 60, which puts it down to 41 with the discount.
Thank you, Representative Owens. Mr. Speaker, may I continue?
You may.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So this is the problem with this. We don't have a lot of really good numbers. In fact, I bet if you checked today's prices, there was a misstatement earlier that our projections are based on the Moody's forecast. That's not true. Moody's gave us a forecast, and that wasn't conservative enough for us. So what our projections are based on is the futures of oil on March 13th. Since March 13th, the price of oil has changed quite a bit, and so have the futures. And in fact, I bet if you took the barrels produced that we're using for our projections times the new prices, you would find that this $120 million increase is actually quite negative if you change those numbers from a month ago to now. Also, you know, another problem with this quick, let's get it done and out of here bill is we didn't have the time to go to the oil and gas division and find out what their projections are for production for the next 10 years. And if they have numbers from the Energy Information Association and see what those numbers are. I bet if you looked at those, you would find that over 10 years, this bill, if we pass it and the governor signs it, is going to cost us over $6 billion over 10 years. So my point isn't necessarily, I mean, maybe we need to do something with triggers. It's a very volatile market. It's hard to budget, and that's why we use the best information we have available. And on March 13th, the best information we had available were future prices that we got off the internet. Those prices have changed. We should be using that information. We have more information from the oil and gas division that the finance and tax department apparently didn't seek out. And I think this is a rushed idea. I think it's a bad idea, and I think we should vote red. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Strinden, second time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A previous speaker said that we're in the mindset of grabbing as much as we can as fast as we can. This gives me the image of us as legislators leeching off of the industry. In fact, and you know this is our oil, North Dakota's oil. This is the people's oil, and it is a privilege for industry to be able to take it out of the ground. We deserve a fair extraction tax for giving them our one-time harvest. And the oil industry has become fabulously rich off of North Dakota. It's a privilege for them to drill here. The industry is not going to go anywhere, and the oil is going to be there. I know that a lot of you are probably thinking I'm anti-business, but there's a difference between being anti-business and wanting to balance industry with selling North Dakota's resources for what they're worth, and I really think that we're worth more than 9.5%. I agree with many of our speakers. The triggers are not ideal, but we can reform the triggers without lowering the extraction tax. Thank you.
Representative Hedlund.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would Representative Guggisberg answer a question?
Representative Guggisberg, would you yield the question?
Mr. Speaker, I would.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Guggisberg, you threw out $6 billion over 10 years. First part of the question, where did you come up with that number? Second part of the question, if that's the case, how much revenue does the state get in the next 10 years? Because if we lose $6 billion, we certainly are going to be collecting quite a bit.
Representative Guggisberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I did get the numbers from Lynn Helms from the Oil and Gas Division. He gave me the data. He gave me the projections that they use in their division. He also gave me the numbers they use based on what they do is they take the Brent crude prices, and they have those from the Energy Information Administration. I think I said association earlier. Administration, and then they have a factor that they use to get that price down to North Dakota price. So they have annual numbers for that, and then if you take their future projections and the number that they come up with based on historical data, I suppose, and that is where you come up with just over $6 billion. And the reason that I didn't want to get into exact numbers is because I just put this information together today and I'm having it verified. But I don't think it's going to be too far off. You're right. So the state in oil extraction taxes over those 10 years would collect about $21 billion, and but it would under this plan would forego over $6.5 billion. And like I said, I didn't want to use these numbers because I would like to verify them first.
Mr. Speaker, if I
Representative
can
Hedlund.
continue.
Go ahead. Representative Hedlund.
Oh, I apologize. I thought you were finished. Well, Mr. Speaker, I think, there's an important point to be made here. We heard the estimate about how much revenue we're going to lose, but failed to want to talk about, the actual number of what would be collected. And certainly there is a difference there. But again, it's purely speculative. I don't think anybody can say for certain this is what's happened. It's based on assumptions. And we can put out any number we want, frankly, Mr. Speaker, if we want to budget on assumptions. But the truth is, and the reality is, that doesn't work very well in government.
Representative Mitskog.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Mr. Speaker, and members of the Assembly. I'll say it for the third time today. I'm very concerned that this bill just ended up in our committee, and we are going to be acting on legislation that is so important and impactful for our state with so little time. I think our citizens and people that we represent expect more out of us, that we take our time and do our due diligence to make very well-educated, concerted efforts or decisions. And I'm frankly even more disappointed that this has turned into a partisan issue when we should be working together for such an important issue in our state that has ramifications for generations. This morning I heard questions that weren't answered. I heard questions this afternoon about the taxes and the triggers. Changes may need to be made, but you know what? Let's get together at the table. I suggest that we study this, but to act at the last week, and maybe this has been talked about all session, but we've not heard it in our committee, and I'm wondering why, and I'm disappointed. I would have liked to have more time to prepare, asked a few more questions in making such an important decision for our state.
Representative Scarpel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members of the Assembly. My first session was in 1993. And since that time, for the most part, I've been very proud of the work we've done and the methodologies we've used to do it. But this is a low point to me. I think this is a mistake to make this decision in this environment. The oil industry has done some wonderful things for North Dakota. There's no doubt about it. I have a classmate who, because of her family and her extended family's medical issues, was on the verge of bankruptcy. And they started drilling for oil on her property, and today she's probably one of the richest women in northwest North Dakota. It's done wonderful things. But there are also many people in western North Dakota who would like to go back 10, 15 years to a previous time when we didn't have all of this. And we can't go back there. I believe in eliminating the trigger, but I don't believe there is the urgency to do it in the fashion that this bill recommends. I think there's a much more acceptable way to do it, and I'm unfortunately going to have to vote against this bill. I think it could have been graduated down over a period of time. The Upper Great Plains Transportation Institute has predicted by 2025 we will have to have spent nearly $10 billion on the roads of North Dakota. Those of you that are going to be here in the future are going to have to find the money to do that. I'm not going to be one of them. I've made that decision. There are tremendous needs across this state that are going to need to be met, both ongoing and one time. And as we keep lowering the revenue coming in, at some point in time, costs are going to intersect with revenue. And I'm not sure that this is the choice that we ought to be making. I believe infrastructure will suffer because of it. I think it's inherently wrong to rush. And I have never had a royalty owner in western North Dakota tell me that their taxes on their mineral royalties are too high. So I don't understand the urgency. And if there was an appropriate way to do this. It should have been taken into place some time back and have been much more thoroughly discussed than it's been able to get discussed in this short period of time. So members of this assembly, you need to think about what you're going to do in the future, how you're going to pay for the things you want to have, how you're going to pay for Red River water supply, how you're going to pay for flood control, how you're going to pay for the roads, how you're going to pay for the schools, because it's going to get more difficult. It's not always going to be this easy, and there's no guarantee the industry's going to stay. The trigger was a great idea at the time it was put in place, but just because something's a great idea at one time doesn't mean it continues to be, and it doesn't mean there's an obligation to have to return a favor for getting rid of it. And I'm not disagreeing necessarily that the oil tax is too high, but I think the 2% drop in one fell swoop is too much, too fast.
Representative Kelch.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A while ago it was mentioned that when the 6.5% was put on, that caused the drillers to leave the state of North Dakota. In 1985, the first session I was in the legislature, when we came, oil had gone from $38 down to $8, and the story we were told is that we're losing $1 million a day from the lost revenues in oil. And we thought that was a pretty big deal at the time. Now it's kind of pocket change. It's an afterthought. But it was not because of the 6.5%. It's because OPEC made a decision they're going to produce oil and they're going to send it around the world. And it went down to $5. That's why the drillers left. At the same time, agriculture was in the trigger was put on. Agriculture was in the doldrums. We were losing farmers galore. But at the end of the year, they paid their property tax or they lost their farms. They didn't get tax breaks. They didn't get property tax breaks. They had to pay them. And this is kind of the same vein. Just because an industry gets in a little trouble, they're going to get a big tax break. Another thing, how many dollars out of the billions of dollars have we taken in that we sent back to western North Dakota, the oil counties in North Dakota? That hasn't been talked about. We wouldn't have had those dollars if we'd have been at 4.5% or 9.5% total. We wouldn't have had those dollars to send back there. And the same amount of damage would have been done to those roads and to the infrastructure out there that has been done to this point. So I am going to vote against this. I just see this as too quick. It's not vetted, and I'd urge the body to vote against it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Kaepernick, second time.
Okay, second time. Mr. Speaker, members of the Assembly, I got up here right now and I'm going to disclaimer because I know I got a phone call last time I used their name, but it's Flint Hills Resource crude oil posting for last Friday. Northern Sweet was 35 actually, $35 a barrel. Medium sour was $29.90, and sour was $19.75. That's what we're getting paid on taxes today in the state of North Dakota. It don't matter what West Texas is doing. That's part of the trigger. But what we're getting paid taxes on is what we're collecting in this state. It has nothing to do with West Texas or Brent or whatever you want to use it at. I mean, and those are future prices. Actually, West Texas right now is down to, they're $43.75 is what they're actually getting down there. You know, when you look at the futures prices, doesn't mean what you're getting paid. And that's one of the disingenuous arguments in this whole assembly on when we set these triggers. Is we're getting discounted in this state. And I asked an operator here a while back, I says, what's your tax problems? Because I was looking at some credits or something to help with accessing pipelines and stuff. And he just laughed and said, taxes aren't our problem. They're investing whatever they can back into the fields. And, you know, and it comes down to, if we really think that this is a long-term play, I think we should be looking at this long term. I agree, 11.5, that's part of the business model that they came in on when they came up here. and I disagree. I was working in the oil fields in '82 when that tax came on. We stacked a rig down in the fall of '82, and that's the last time I ever worked on a drilling rig. That thing was, they disappeared basically in '83. There was zero for rigs out here. I know, I worked out there. This thing finally came back in, and I got to give Representative Scarpo the initiative. I signed on to it, but when we gave that tax holiday in 1995 to basically bring in new production or new horizontal drilling was a new process at that time, and we started getting oil back in. Started getting companies back into the state, and it took that long. It took basically 10 years before it really started to pick up again, because I was back out in the oil field again, and from 9 on, it's been just phenomenal. But I'll tell you, there's real lives at stake here, and there's people leaving the state as I speak because of this. And when you look at these prices, what actual companies, what they're actually getting out here and what they're paying taxes on, you can use whatever number you want. I mean, liars figure and figures lie, but it comes down to where that's what they're getting paid today. And so you can look at it. We're trying to straighten this out, so we do know that that fits within their business model, that they stay out here, and they, hopefully in 2050 or whenever this thing is starting to play out, that we do have, they're still here today. We'll go through another generation of people young people that'll have good paying jobs and stuff out here. I think we should pass this to get this so we do have where we aren't jumping up and down on these. We can roll the dice on, a lot of companies where earlier in the session, I thought I'd fight against trying to change the model of what came in at, let the companies get their 6.5% tax break on it and then play the game trying to get it back on again. But after thinking about it for the last 3 months, this makes sense to make sure we know where we're at and when we're going to in the future. So I still vote green on this. Thank you.
Representative Onstead.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's one player that we're not taking into consideration here, and we want to talk about revenue, but they're a major partner here with us, and that's the 3 affiliated tribes, 20 to 30%. Currently, we're sharing those revenues with 3 affiliated tribes. If this goes forward as it is, they've made the statement on several occasions that they might withdraw from the compact. I don't think that's good for the industry. I don't think that would be good for the North Dakota. But because they're such a player with us, this short a decision introduced on Friday, kicking out on Monday, I know they were probably aware of it. Let them weigh in too. But I think that's a consideration. I think we owe them that portion, because if they withdraw from this compact, I'm not sure what will happen with the industry and the state of North Dakota. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Carlson.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't know how the rest of you have been following oil during the session, but we have a little board up in our office that every day tracks the price of oil, because it's a tremendous concern to us to balance the budget and to understand what our revenues could or could not be. We are at today 3 months and 20 days into the 5-month period for the big trigger. Now, you could say that they've rebounded a little bit and maybe it'll never happen. But I've been amazed by the debate, because we haven't talked about the bill. The bill doesn't cut the tax today. The bill only reduces the tax if the trigger hits. It may never hit. And I hear people standing up and agreeing, that trigger's probably a bad deal, but we should study it. But for the first time this year, when we came into the December forecast, the governor said we're going to have $8.2 billion worth of money. If we want to use numbers, I got a lot of numbers. 8.2. When the House looked at it in January, we said, wow, the price of oil is below $74, and he added his budget based on $74 to $82 oil and 1.2 billion barrels a day going to 1.4 during the biennium. We said, I don't think that's going to happen. So we talked to industry, and we talked to the tax commissioner, and we talked to the oil and gas people, and we've talked to the guys with boots on the ground and said, what's going to happen to this industry? And they said, you better lower your projections because it's not going to happen. So the House, in agreement with the Senate, lowered the projection down. Well, we lowered it down so the rail revenue was about $4.2 billion, $4 billion less. $4 billion than we thought we were going to spend. I don't care whose checkbook you're running, that's a lot of money. So then we said, well, let's wait and we'll budget on that, and then when March comes, we'll reset it again based on, guess what? Oil that everybody says we're so rapidly moving into. We've been talking about this since the first day. So now we get a new forecast and it goes down to 3.6 billion instead of 4.2. And then we run some numbers. Everybody loves to run numbers. I like to run numbers. I have all kinds of numbers here. But then I said, what happens if the trigger doesn't stay on for just 11 months like we figured? You know what that number goes to? $2.2 billion if that stays on all biennium. $6 billion reduction in oil revenue in one biennium, of which $850 million has already gone today because of the price of oil, nothing to do with the triggers. The little trigger's in effect. The big trigger goes into effect after 5 months below the target price. It goes into effect, and then it takes 5 months above that price to get it out. Pretty simple mathematics, but really hard to budget on as a legislature. You know, everybody in this place had an opportunity to address a bill to deal with the triggers. Talk about rushing things through. You know what? There weren't any bills. And there weren't any bills that said lower it a little bit at a time. And we have been meeting with the 3 affiliated tribes. I've met no less than 5 times with them, and once I met with the leaders from the minority party in both chambers. And their threat was, not really a threat, but they said, you know, we don't want to be part of the trigger. So when they were asked in committee day, what are you going to do if the trigger hits? Are you going to accept it? Are you going to reject it? Are you going to get out of the compact? And they weren't really sure. So did we take them into account when we looked at this? If you remember the end of last session, the last days of the session, we'd killed the bill on oil distribution and formula to the Native Americans in the 3 affiliated. We brought it back the next day and passed it at 50-50. And there was a lot of people that were really not too keen on doing that, but it meant an awful lot of money to the 3 affiliated tribes. Looking back, it was probably the right thing to do, but it did cause a lot of consternation with other people that get distributions from the oil money. So first of all, I've never seen another bill introduced. We had a hearing. We invited anybody that wanted to speak. Maybe we should be a little more efficient once in a while and move things a little faster through here. But the point was that everybody that wanted to have input had input. The industry showed up. There's oil producers, by the way, that were banking on getting that tax break and having that rate reduced. And we are raising their taxes. We are not lowering their taxes. We're raising them. You know, this isn't just a North Dakota issue. If we had a Keystone Pipeline today, we would save $10 a barrel on a lot of our oil because we wouldn't have to pay that premium to get it out of here. If the Iranians cut a deal and have these millions of barrels that we've embargoed show up on the market, we could be looking at $30 oil in a month. I don't think anybody wants that. And remember, we only tax on what we get. When you take the price, the West Texas price, you deduct between 5% and 12% depending on where you're at. That's what you tax on. That means you're down in the $40 to $30 range like Representative Kempenich said. So this is a complicated industry. The rigs today, by the way, we had budgeted at 1.1 million barrels a day in our latest forecast with 100 rigs. Today there's 90 rigs. We normally frack 135 wells a month. Last month they did 45. We have 95 wells waiting to be fracked. Are they going to frack them because of this trigger? Are they going to give up their best production for a tax or a price of oil that's so low? If you have all those answers, I'd like to know them. Because every number that was put out here today was pure speculation. I can give you numbers that show that if the prices go back, we'll raise $6.8 million or $1 billion in oil revenue if it goes back to the governor's projection with a 9.5% rate. $6.8 billion. But we never take into account the money you lose when the trigger's on. It's funny, it's never subtracted. We only talk about how much we lost. And I understand that you'd like to have more money to spend, but I don't believe that that's what our citizens are asking for either. So this is not being rushed through the system. This issue's been talked about in this chamber many times, and it's time for us to put a very simple piece of legislation in place. It becomes much more reliable for us to plan. It becomes much more reliable for the businesses that extract that oil from the ground. And by the way, that isn't our oil. That oil belongs to those people that are on the ground that have the mineral rights to it. So we need to remember that. We just happen to be able to tax that as it passes through. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm saying that this is good policy. Long term, this is good policy for the state of North Dakota. It creates a stable environment. Some people are going to lose money on this deal because they wanted a tax break. If it happens, it might not happen now, it might not happen in October, it might not happen next May, but if it does happen, our rate's going down, and I think that's the right thing to do.
Representative Onstead.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate those comments from my good friend, and I hope we still remain good friends after I question everything that he's presented today. But when we asked Moody Analytics, and I think we used them for 17 or 18 years to set our budget, because I don't think anybody's got the expertise here in this chamber to know what's going to happen 12, 18 months. But they do have the experience, and we continue to use them. And they help set our forecast for that. And part of our forecasting this biennium was using Moody Analytics. At one time they said that they didn't think the trigger would happen. And then we kind of questioned that point. And then they backed off and said if the trigger does happen. So we built the forecast if the trigger happened. But also we rely on it on a firm that has nationwide status and expertise who talks to that industry almost daily. And that's why we set the budget the way we set it. And we rely on that. And we have relied that on the past, and I know we'll rely on that in the future. Moody Analytics. Keystone Pipeline. 60,000 barrels North Dakota has going in the Keystone. What are we producing, 1.1 million? That's not going to make a big impact to the state of North Dakota in their production. And so, a lot of good comments are made. I think a lot of statements that are here today and have thought process going forward. And we appreciate that. We appreciate that in the assembly here. But part of that is where we're at, and skeptics, I think we have to rely on Moody Analytics to a point. We can be conservative in those values. And we've gone on for how many years? In anticipation, whatever the price of oil will be and other things. So, Mr. Speaker, and ladies and gentlemen of the Assembly, this is not the right time to deal with this. I think it has to have a larger discussion, and I think we should reject this, Mr. Speaker.
Representative P. Anderson, second time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and members of the Assembly. Over the weekend and today, all of the emails and phone calls I have received have said, vote no. I have not received any resident, any citizen saying, vote yes on this bill. North Dakota citizens do not want this bill. Please vote no.
Is there further discussion? The House has before it for final consideration House Bill 1476. The clerk will open the key and you may record your vote. Has every member voted? Do any members wish to change their vote? The key will be closed and the clerk will take the record. The final vote shows 57 yea, 32 nay, 5 absent not voting. House Bill 1476 is declared passed.